So the research that we're rolling out this week is really designed to help brands understand the changing forces of influence that consumers are exposed to and kind of what that means for how brands cut through the clutter. So we explored things like the explosion of information that consumers have access to, the fact that people are turning to social media, for example, to get their news. We looked at the fact that information asymmetry, which is a very traditional part of the buyer-seller relationship, like you're selling a car, you know things that the buyer doesn't know, that's information asymmetry, it's gone. If a consumer wants to understand something, they can find the information, right? So it just requires like a level of authenticity and realness from brands that I think was nice to have before, but more of a requirement now. The fact that trust is changing, right? So people are moving from trust in institutions, think like large-scale institutions, to people. So that means things like influencers are even more important than perhaps we give them credit for, as consumers are turning, again, away from traditional sources of information to other people, like influencers. You have generative AI, which didn't exist 3 years ago, and now you have consumers making purchase decisions because of generative AI. I mean, we have something like 44% of people telling us they trust product recommendations that they find in Gen AI, and that's a leap up even from a year ago. So these are kind of big changes. For brands then. They are only one in a sea of many, many voices that are influencing people. We also found that consumers don't really feel the love from brands right now. Something like 71% of consumers said, I think they're only after me for my dollars. 50+% of people said brands don't kind of care about me or try to court me the way that they used to.
Why? Why has that changed?
So it's such an interesting question. Why has that changed? One of the things that we looked at in the piece as well was kind of the role of brand in consumer decision making. And one of the things that we found is that investment in brand overall is down. And that is not what CMOs want, but they face an enormous amount of pressure to prove the value of brand investment. And by the way, there's lots of research that does actually prove that brand investment can drive business performance, and yet CMOs are under a ton of pressure. So brand investment is down. They're chasing direct response goals because they probably feel like they have to, and consumers are feeling it. They're just feeling it. So what we wanted to do then is say, well, what the heck does a brand do when they are faced with consumers that have all these other sources of influence? By the way, they're also saying that their attention is not great. 63% of consumers say that their attention is okay or not great. 4 in 10 consumers tell us that they don't notice ads on social media where there are a lot of ads. So something about the kind of traditional model isn't working as well as it used to.
Even with all the technology out there,
Correct.
It's really a whole mindset change.
Correct. And so, just saying that isn't enough. You have to sort of help a brand understand then, well, what do I do when consumers are either not noticing me or don't feel like I care about them? You have to challenge some of the traditional paradigms, right? So the old rules around how brands grow. So you start thinking about things like accessing consumers' mental availability, reach and frequency. Now, reach and frequency is incredibly important. It's table stakes, but it's no longer sufficient. So the question becomes, when you reach someone, how do you reach them at a moment of salience for that consumer? How do you reach them at a moment when you're likelier to influence them in a positive way? Well, one of the things you do is you don't stop at reach and frequency. You start working to access their emotional availability, so not just mental, but emotional availability. Because consumers are telling us that they're open, they want connection, they want to feel as though brands care about them, they want authenticity and transparency. So if you're only chasing reach and frequency, you are not going far enough. So that's kind of the sort of philosophical answer, but then the tactical answer is, where do you go in media to find those opportunities? And this is where it becomes really clear that as Omnicom Media, we can actually create very cool co-devs with partners to maximize the chances that a brand, when they might have an opportunity to influence a person, gets like the biggest bang for their buck in that moment. So I'll give you a live example. influencers. We talked about influencers as being a source of trust for consumers when they're making purchase decisions, and just in general. But picking the right influencers can't just be about, follower count or buzz metrics. It has to be about being really sophisticated about understanding which influencers are the right influencers to get at your audience in the moments that matter to them. So those are the kinds of co-developments that we're doing with companies like Walmart and Meta, which Megan would have talked about earlier in the week.
So what about live TV? Where's live streaming going?
Yeah, live is an amazing example of this, but you have to think beyond the obvious, right? So when people think live, they think, oh, I just need to buy, a spot in a big tentpole event. That's fine. There's a lot of value in that, but again, necessary but not sufficient. So how do you think about using things like addressability, using programmatic technologies, not just to be present in live, but to create the most bang for your buck? So live example would be something like, no pun intended, would be something like bidding programmatically in sports on Disney to get the first ad impression that a person sees when they join the live sporting event on streaming TV. The salience is so high at that moment. They haven't seen any other ads. They're just joining that sports broadcast, and you are there with the very first ad. That is how you capture outsized influence in an environment like live.
So in practical terms, how is Omnicom Media going to apply this research?
So this is what's so cool, and what I love about my job so much is that when you write research for research's sake, it doesn't have as much value as when you write research that you turn into something that has practical application. So I've given a couple examples of co-devs that we've done. We do lots of co-developments with partners like Amazon, Walmart, Meta, Pinterest, you name it, right? These are all important, TikTok, these are all important partners for us, Disney, the Trade Desk, the list goes on. Google, a huge partner. Because when you can develop something that is unique and creates competitive advantage for a client that taps into a super important consumer or market insight, you are bringing the client to the head of the line with where media is going and how consumers are behaving. So that's the important marriage, is the marriage of an insight through thought leadership and research, and the build of a co-development opportunity that takes advantage of that insight and creates something new for a client.